Life rarely announces the moment when direction is lost. It does not arrive with a clear rupture or a dramatic event, but with a subtle erosion of meaning that unfolds quietly inside the mind and the body. At some point, decisions that once felt intuitive begin to feel heavy, as if every possible path carries an invisible risk. The days continue to move forward, yet something essential feels misaligned, as though life itself were speaking in a language that no longer makes sense. In this state, the longing for connection with the universe is not mystical curiosity. It is an emotional necessity, a search for orientation in the middle of internal noise. What many people experience here is not a lack of faith, but an excess of mental interference. Thoughts multiply, interpretations compete, and the desire for certainty becomes overwhelming. Signs are searched for everywhere, not as guidance, but as reassurance that one is not making a mistake simply by existing. This is where anxiety quietly disguises itself as spirituality, transforming the universe into a source of constant validation rather than genuine relationship. The more one seeks confirmation, the less grounded one feels, until intuition itself becomes suspect and silence feels threatening. This introduction invites a different approach. Instead of asking how to receive clearer signs, it asks what must settle inside for clarity to emerge naturally. Connection in this sense is not about receiving messages from outside, but about restoring internal coherence, so perception can function without distortion. When the nervous system is perpetually alert, every coincidence becomes charged, and every pause feels like abandonment. When coherence returns, the same world begins to communicate differently, not through dramatic signals, but through a quiet sense of alignment that makes decisions feel honest again. The purpose of this journey is not to promise certainty or eliminate doubt. It is to explore how direction reappears when illusion dissolves, how real signs differ from anxious projections, and how a grounded connection with the universe can exist without fantasy, urgency, or emotional dependency. In that space, meaning does not shout, it settles. When the search for signs becomes anxiety, the moment the search for signs begins to dominate awareness, something subtle has already shifted inside. What initially appears as openness to guidance slowly transforms into vigilance, a constant scanning of reality for confirmation that one is safe, aligned, or moving in the right direction. This vigilance is rarely conscious. It feels reasonable, even spiritual, yet beneath it lives a quiet tension that never fully rests. The universe, once perceived as a field of support, begins to resemble a tribunal, silently judging each decision and withholding approval until the correct interpretation is found. In this inner climate, life stops being experienced directly and starts being evaluated. Every coincidence carries weight, every pause feels suspicious, and every delay is interpreted as a warning. The mind constructs meaning at high speed, not because insight is present, but because uncertainty has become unbearable. Direction does not disappear because the path is gone. It disappears because the observer is no longer present enough to walk it. Attention fragments pulled between imagined futures and feared outcomes, while the present moment becomes merely a place to wait for proof. Anxiety thrives in this space because it feeds on anticipation rather than reality. It does not trust organic unfolding. It demands assurance in advance, transforming intuition into something that must justify itself. What once felt like an inner compass becomes unreliable, not because it has failed, but because it is constantly questioned. The person does not feel lost because there is no direction, but because every possible direction feels equally threatening. Choice itself becomes heavy, and stillness becomes intolerable. This state often masquerades as heightened awareness. The person believes they are becoming more conscious, more sensitive, more attuned, when in truth, they are becoming more reactive. Sensitivity without grounding amplifies noise. The nervous system remains activated, and perception loses depth. Instead of recognizing patterns over time, the mind grasps at isolated moments, assigning them significance without context. Meaning becomes inflated, then collapses, leaving behind confusion and emotional exhaustion. What is rarely acknowledged is that this anxious search for signs is not rooted in spirituality, but in fear of responsibility. Not responsibility as obligation, but responsibility as ownership of one's own becoming. If a sign decides, then the individual is spared the discomfort of uncertainty. If the universe must confirm every step, then personal agency remains suspended. The cost of this suspension is subtle but profound. Life begins to feel like something happening to the person rather than something moving through them. As this pattern deepens, trust erodes. Not trust in the universe, but trust in oneself. The individual no longer believes they can feel their way forward without external validation. Silence becomes threatening because it offers no answers. Stillness becomes uncomfortable because it exposes internal unrest. In this condition, even moments of clarity are short-lived, quickly overridden by doubt. Relief arrives briefly, then disappears, creating a cycle that resembles dependency rather than connection. The paradox is that real direction does not emerge from heightened searching, but from relaxed perception. When the nervous system is no longer bracing for impact, awareness widens naturally. Instead of forcing meaning, meaning reveals itself through consistency, tone, and resonance. True signals do not shout or demand attention. They arrive quietly, often confirming what has already been sensed but not yet trusted. Anxiety, by contrast, creates urgency. It insists that answers must arrive now, or something will be lost forever. In the anxious state, the universe becomes externalized. It is imagined as something separate, watching, responding, withholding, or approving. This separation intensifies the feeling of disconnection. The individual feels small in relation to a vast, unpredictable force. Yet genuine connection does not create smallness. It creates orientation. It does not remove uncertainty, but it makes uncertainty navigable. When anxiety dominates, even guidance feels unsafe because it cannot be controlled. What restores balance is not the elimination of doubt, but the restoration of coherence. Coherence is the state in which thought, emotion, and sensation begin to move in the same direction. When this alignment returns, the need for constant interpretation dissolves. The person no longer looks for signs everywhere because they are no longer lost inside. Direction reappears not as certainty, but as a felt sense of integrity. Decisions begin to feel congruent rather than pressured. This chapter does not attempt to dismantle the desire for meaning, but to clarify its distortion. The search for signs becomes unhealthy when it replaces presence. It becomes anxious when it is driven by fear rather than curiosity. Connection with the universe does not require constant confirmation. It requires the courage to remain present long enough for perception to settle. When that settling occurs, life no longer needs to speak loudly. Its language becomes subtle, steady, and trustworthy again. Coherence and the return of inner direction. Direction does not disappear abruptly. It fades as internal coherence dissolves, leaving behind a sense of fragmentation that is often mistaken for confusion about life itself. In reality, what fractures first is not purpose but alignment. Thoughts move in one direction, emotions in another, and the body responds with tension, fatigue, or restlessness. When these layers no longer communicate clearly, perception loses stability. The individual feels as though something essential is missing, yet cannot name what it is. Coherence is not an abstract concept. It is a lived condition in which inner signals no longer contradict one another. When coherence is present, the mind does not argue with the body, and emotion does not sabotage intention. There is a sense of internal agreement, subtle but unmistakable, that allows experience to flow without constant resistance. When coherence is absent, life feels noisy. Even simple decisions generate disproportionate stress, and every choice carries emotional weight far beyond its actual consequence. In this incoherent state, people often attempt to restore direction by thinking harder. They analyze possibilities, rehearse outcomes, and revisit the past in search of clues. This effort rarely brings relief because coherence is not produced through mental force. It emerges when attention, emotion, and sensation begin to synchronize again. Without this synchronization, information is processed through distortion. The mind may reach conclusions, but they feel unstable, easily overturned by doubt or fear. One of the most subtle effects of incoherence is the erosion of trust in one's own perception. The individual may still sense impulses, intuitions, or inclinations, but these signals feel unreliable. They are immediately questioned, filtered, or dismissed. This creates a dependency on external frameworks, opinions, or signs to compensate for the loss of inner agreement. Over time, this dependency deepens the disconnection, reinforcing the belief that direction exists outside rather than within experience itself. The body plays a central role in this dynamic. Long before confusion becomes conceptual, it is physiological. Chronic stress, unresolved emotional memory, and prolonged vigilance imprint themselves into the nervous system. The body learns to anticipate threat, even in neutral situations. When this anticipation becomes habitual, stillness feels unsafe and clarity feels fragile. The person may crave peace, yet feel uncomfortable when peace appears, because the system has adapted to tension as a baseline. This adaptation explains why direction can feel elusive even when circumstances improve. External stability does not immediately translate into internal ease. The body may continue operating as though instability were imminent, generating subtle anxiety that clouds perception. In such conditions, intuition is not absent, but muffled. It speaks through a nervous system that is no longer attuned to subtlety, only to urgency. As a result, life feels flat or overwhelming with little middle ground. Coherence begins to return when attention softens rather than intensifies. When the individual allows experience to unfold without constant evaluation, internal signals gradually regain clarity. Emotional responses become more proportionate, and bodily sensations begin to settle. This settling is not dramatic. It is felt as a reduction in background noise, a quieting of internal commentary. In that quiet, direction does not announce itself as a revelation. It appears as a sense of rightness that does not require justification. As coherence stabilizes, the relationship with uncertainty changes. Uncertainty no longer feels like danger, but like space. Possibility replaces threat. The individual can remain present without demanding immediate answers. This tolerance for not knowing is essential for authentic connection because it allows perception to deepen over time. Instead of reacting to isolated moments, the person begins to notice patterns, rhythms, and consistencies that were previously obscured by tension. This shift also alters the meaning of signs. When coherence is absent, signs are sought as reassurance. When coherence is present, signs are recognized as confirmation. The difference lies not in the external event, but in the internal state of the observer. A coherent system does not grasp for meaning. It receives it. Recognition replaces interpretation. Life feels less like a puzzle to be solved, and more like a dialogue unfolding at its own pace. Importantly, coherence does not eliminate difficulty. Challenges continue to arise, and uncertainty remains part of the human condition. What changes is the quality of engagement. Decisions are made with greater integrity, even when outcomes are unclear. The individual no longer needs certainty to move forward, because movement itself restores confidence. Direction becomes something lived, not something awaited. As coherence deepens, the sense of separation between self and universe begins to soften. The individual no longer feels like a solitary entity navigating an indifferent world. Instead, experience takes on a relational quality. Actions feel responsive rather than reactive. Choices feel informed by something larger than fear, yet grounded in reality. This is not transcendence in the dramatic sense, but alignment in the practical one. The return of direction is rarely marked by a single moment. It emerges gradually as coherence becomes familiar again. The mind stops racing ahead of the present. The body stops bracing against imagined futures. Emotion regains its fluidity. In this integrated state, life no longer needs to provide constant reassurance. Direction is felt as continuity, as a sense that each step belongs to a larger movement that does not need to be fully known to be trusted. Shadow, meaning, and the illusion of disconnection. There is a particular kind of disconnection that does not come from distance, but from avoidance. It emerges when parts of the inner world are excluded from awareness because they feel incompatible with the image one holds of oneself. This exclusion does not erase what is rejected. It pushes it into the background, where it continues to influence perception, emotion, and behavior in indirect ways. In this state, the individual may speak of connection, alignment, or higher purpose, while simultaneously experiencing confusion, resistance, or self-sabotage. The contradiction is not moral, it is structural, meaning fractures when inner experience is divided. The mind attempts to maintain coherence, by presenting a simplified narrative of who one is and what one stands for. Emotions or impulses that do not fit this narrative are quietly suppressed. Over time, this suppression creates tension. Energy that could move forward is redirected inward, maintaining a fragile balance that requires constant effort. Life begins to feel heavy, not because it is demanding, but because so much energy is spent holding parts of the self apart. This dynamic often hides behind refined language and sincere intention. A person may believe they are seeking connection with the universe, while unconsciously seeking permission to avoid aspects of themselves that feel uncomfortable or threatening. Anger may be reframed as calm detachment, fear as intuition, resignation as acceptance. These reinterpretations are rarely deliberate. They arise from a desire to remain consistent with an internal ideal. Yet the cost of this consistency is depth. Without depth, connection becomes abstract, and direction loses its grounding. The illusion of disconnection often emerges here. The individual feels unseen or unsupported, interpreting life's resistance as absence of guidance. In reality, what is being resisted is not the person, but the fragmentation within them. When inner contradictions are unresolved, experience cannot fully integrate. Signals that challenge the established narrative are ignored or misread. Opportunities that require emotional honesty are postponed. Patterns repeat, and the repetition is interpreted as fate rather than unfinished integration. Shadow, in this context, is not a moral failing. It is the accumulation of unlived experience. Desires that were deemed unacceptable, needs that were minimized, impulses that were judged too risky, all become part of the background influence shaping perception. These elements do not disappear. They seek expression through indirect channels, often as anxiety, indecision, or a persistent sense of dissatisfaction that cannot be explained by external circumstances. When the shadow is active, connection becomes conditional. The person feels aligned only when circumstances affirm their preferred self-image. When life introduces challenge, ambiguity, or contradiction, connection feels threatened. The universe is then perceived as distant or unresponsive. This perception reinforces the belief that something essential is missing, when in fact something essential is being avoided. Direction cannot stabilize when significant portions of experience remain unacknowledged. This avoidance also affects the interpretation of signs. The individual may gravitate toward symbols or meanings that reinforce their existing identity, while dismissing those that invite change. Synchronicities that demand courage are minimized. Coincidences that justify stagnation are emphasized. Meaning becomes selective, filtered through comfort rather than truth. Over time, this selectivity erodes trust, because reality no longer feels honest. The person senses, often unconsciously, that something is being left out. The tension created by this omission manifests as restlessness. Even moments of apparent clarity feel incomplete. Decisions are made, but doubt lingers. Achievements are reached, but fulfillment remains elusive. The individual may interpret this as a spiritual failure or a lack of alignment, intensifying the search for external confirmation. Yet no amount of confirmation can compensate for internal division. Direction cannot emerge from a fragmented center. Integration does not require dramatic confrontation. It begins with recognition. When previously excluded experiences are allowed into awareness without immediate judgment, internal space expands. Emotions regain their informational value, rather than being treated as obstacles. Desires are seen as signals rather than threats. This inclusion does not disrupt connection. It deepens it. The individual begins to experience wholeness not as perfection, but as honesty. As integration unfolds, the relationship with meaning changes. Life no longer needs to conform to an idealized narrative to feel significant. Meaning arises from participation rather than interpretation. The individual becomes less concerned with appearing aligned and more attuned to being present. This presence restores a sense of continuity. Experiences feel connected, even when they are challenging. Direction becomes less about destination and more about integrity of movement. The illusion of disconnection dissolves when the self is no longer divided against itself. What was perceived as absence of guidance reveals itself as resistance to inclusion. As inner experience becomes more coherent, perception clears. The universe no longer appears distant because the observer is no longer hiding. Connection resumes not as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady sense of belonging within experience itself. In this state, signs regain their proper scale. They are no longer substitutes for self-trust, nor rewards for correct behavior. They are reflections of alignment already in motion. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted from events. It is lived through engagement. Direction is no longer sought as something to be discovered, but recognized as something that emerges naturally, when the inner world is allowed to be whole. Synchronicity. Without fantasy and the quiet language of reality, when the inner landscape begins to settle, the way life is perceived changes in subtle but decisive ways. Events no longer feel random nor excessively charged with meaning. Instead, they acquire context. This shift is often misunderstood as the arrival of signs, when in truth it is the maturation of perception. Synchronicity, in its grounded form, is not a spectacle. It is a quiet correspondence between inner readiness and outer circumstance that feels natural rather than extraordinary. Fantasy thrives in fragmentation. When coherence is absent, the mind fills gaps with interpretation, constructing narratives that promise reassurance or escape. Coincidences are inflated into messages, and ambiguity is treated as mystery. This inflation temporarily relieves uncertainty, but it also destabilizes trust. Reality begins to feel unreliable, as though it were constantly testing or misleading. In this environment, synchronicity loses its depth and becomes entertainment, consumed rather than integrated. As coherence returns, the relationship with coincidence becomes calmer. The individual no longer feels compelled to assign immediate meaning to every occurrence. Events are allowed to unfold without urgency. In this space, certain moments stand out not because they are dramatic, but because they resonate. Resonance has a different quality than excitement. It does not demand attention. It invites recognition. It aligns rather than stimulates. Synchronicity without fantasy emerges when the observer no longer needs the world to confirm an identity. When self-understanding stabilizes, external events are perceived more accurately. The person notices patterns over time rather than isolated incidents. A conversation echoes an internal realization. A delay redirects attention towards something previously ignored. An opportunity arises at the precise moment when resistance has softened. These moments do not feel magical. They feel timely. The quiet language of reality speaks through timing, proportion, and consequence. It does not interrupt the flow of life. It participates in it. This participation becomes visible only when the observer is not projecting expectations onto experience. Projection distorts perception by demanding that reality behave in specific ways. When projection subsides, perception becomes receptive. Meaning is not imposed. It is received. One of the most significant shifts occurs in the relationship with control. Fantasy seeks control through interpretation. It attempts to manage uncertainty by predicting outcomes or decoding symbols. Grounded synchronicity does not offer control. It offers orientation. Orientation allows movement without guaranteeing results. It supports engagement without eliminating risk. This distinction is essential because it restores agency without feeding anxiety. When reality is no longer required to perform, it becomes trustworthy again. The individual stops monitoring experience for confirmation and begins participating in it. Decisions are made with awareness of consequence, yet without paralysis. There is room for adjustment, correction, and learning. Direction becomes flexible rather than rigid. This flexibility is not confusion, it is responsiveness. In this state, the sense of connection with the universe no longer depends on belief. It is felt as continuity between inner and outer movement. Actions feel situated within a larger context, even when the full shape of that context remains unknown. The person experiences themselves as part of an unfolding process rather than an isolated actor awaiting instruction. This participation dissolves the need for constant reassurance. Fantasy collapses under this weight of reality, not because it is disproven, but because it becomes unnecessary. The desire for extraordinary signs fades as ordinary experience regains depth. A quiet morning carries more meaning than a dramatic coincidence. A consistent pattern of alignment feels more reliable than a sudden revelation. The individual no longer oscillates between hope and disappointment. Stability replaces fluctuation. Synchronicity then becomes a refinement rather than a fixation. It appears as alignment between readiness and response. When readiness is absent, events pass unnoticed or feel irrelevant. When readiness is present, the same events acquire significance. This significance does not inflate the self. It grounds it. It reinforces the sense that life responds to engagement, not to demand. The quiet language of reality respects time. It does not rush integration. It allows understanding to mature. In this respect, synchronicity mirrors development. It reflects the stage of awareness rather than dictating it. As awareness deepens, synchronicity becomes less about surprise and more about confirmation, less about mystery and more about coherence. Direction stabilizes in this environment because it is no longer dependent on interpretation. It arises from participation in a rhythm that feels consistent. Even when outcomes are uncertain, the movement itself feels aligned. The individual does not need to know where the path leads to recognize that it is being walked with integrity. This chapter completes the movement from anxious searching to grounded perception. Connection with the universe is revealed not as a stream of messages, but as a relational field that becomes accessible when fantasy dissolves. Reality speaks softly, and it speaks continuously. When the listener is no longer distracted by urgency or expectation, its language becomes clear enough to trust. The return of direction. Without illusion, direction does not return through force nor through constant interpretation of reality. It returns when something essential settles inside. Throughout this journey, the idea of connection with the universe has been gently stripped of fantasy and urgency, not to make it smaller, but to make it real. What often feels like disconnection is revealed as noise, fragmentation, and internal contradiction. When those layers begin to soften, life does not suddenly become easy, but it becomes legible again. The anxious search for signs gives way to a quieter form of trust. Not trust based on guarantees, but trust rooted in coherence. When thought, emotion, and bodily sensation stop pulling in different directions, perception stabilizes. In that stability, meaning no longer needs to be hunted. It appears through consistency, through the way experiences begin to align with inner readiness. The universe no longer feels distant or judgmental. It feels responsive, not because it provides answers, but because it reflects participation. This is the fundamental shift. Connection stops being something external to access and becomes something internal to embody. The individual no longer waits for life to reveal a perfect path before moving. Movement itself becomes the source of clarity. Direction is no longer imagined as a fixed destination, but as an ongoing relationship with reality, shaped by presence and integrity rather than fear. Illusion dissolves when urgency fades. Anxiety loses its grip when certainty is no longer demanded. What remains is a grounded openness, a capacity to remain engaged even when outcomes are unknown. In this state, synchronicities do not disappear, but they change character. They stop functioning as proof and begin functioning as quiet confirmations of alignment already in progress. Connection with the universe, in its most mature form, does not remove doubt or struggle. It reframes them. Doubt becomes part of discernment. Struggle becomes part of growth. Life regains depth, not because every moment feels meaningful, but because experience is no longer fragmented by constant resistance. Direction returns as a felt sense of continuity, a knowing that each step belongs, even when the destination is still unfolding. This is not an ending, but a stabilization, a return to something natural that was obscured by noise. When the inner world becomes more coherent, the outer world no longer needs to shout. Its guidance is subtle, steady, and sufficient. The path reveals itself not all at once, but exactly at the pace required to walk it with awareness. If this reflection touched something quiet but real inside you, consider this question. If you stopped waiting for absolute certainty, what direction might already be asking to be lived through you right now? This channel exists for those moments when meaning begins to stir beneath the surface before it has words. By subscribing, you stay connected to deeper explorations like this one, where presence matters more than promises and clarity grows through understanding rather than urgency. Continue watching on the final screen and allow this conversation with life to keep unfolding.